Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Farmers Weekly's Business Clinic webinar. I'm Susie Horn, Farmers Weekly's business editor. Grew up on farms in East and North Yorkshire, and my brothers are both farmers up there. One's arable, one is mainly sheep. So thank you to everyone for joining the webinar, and thanks to our panel for their time and expertise. Tonight we're going to hear about some typical family farm business issues and answer as many questions from the audience as we can get through. So please, I'll tell you later about how to put questions in, but please feel free to do that during the transmission. So to introduce our panel, first we have Russell Reeves, partner and head of litigation at law firm Thrings. Russell works exclusively on agricultural matters and has answered many Farmers Weekly business clinic queries from readers over the last few years, often on the recurring themes, which he'll talk about later. He's a panel solicitor for the National Farmers Union and a member of many farming and associated bodies. Then we're going to hear from Ross Kent, who's a rural partner with Carter Jonas. Unfortunately, the technical gremlins mean that Ross isn't on camera tonight, but he's very much with us. He's been with Carter Jonas since 2008, and his focus is on farm and estate management. So he's got lots of experience and insight in the family farm dynamics and how to resolve some of the issues that those farming businesses are facing. He also does valuation work alongside sales and purchases of farmland. Our third speaker is Freddie Braithwaite Exley, an account executive with A-Plan Rural Insurance. Hello, Freddie. Freddie works with farms and estates across England and Wales and has a background in rural land management. So he also understands the risks and the concerns of a very wide range of different types of rural businesses. We're going to hear for a few minutes from each of the panelists about the issues that they advise farming families on. And then after the presentations, we'll open things up for discussion and put some of the advanced questions we've received along with the ones that come in during the session. So audience members can ask a legal, management or insurance question at any time. If you just type them into the box at the foot of your screen, and then I'll direct them to the panel members. The webinar is expected to last for about an hour and 15 minutes, and afterwards it will be available on demand. You'll get an email to let you know when the recording's ready to view. So we'll go straight to our first speaker, Russell. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Susie. As Susie said, my team act for farmers the length and breadth of the country, and therefore we're well placed to see the sorts of legal issues which are occurring every day on farms, perhaps your farm or farms near to you. The biggest issues that we are concerned with and are facing and are dealing with at the moment are those which fall into three categories, which I thought I would set out one at a time, just to give you a flavour of the types of disputes which are out there. So the first one of those is known as proprietary Stopple claims, and this has received quite a bit of press in the farming press and also national press. Now, what these claims are essentially about is typically where there's a farming daughter or a farming son that has perhaps worked on the farm for a number of years, maybe 20 years, 30 years, something like that, thinking that the farm would one day be passed to them. And then perhaps a life-changing event happens within the farm, and the farm isn't going to be passed to them. So, for example, maybe the father, the farming father or the farming mother, have a change of heart and decide that actually they're not going to pass the farm to a son or a daughter, and perhaps they're going to pass it to a new wife or something like that. Now, this potentially creates an unfairness for somebody who's worked on the farm for a number of years in the expectation that they will be passed the farm. And what is quite unusual and quite concerning, I suppose, is most people think that if you have a will, assets pass in accordance with the will. But this doctrine called proprietary Stopple actually operates to pass assets outside of the scope of the will. And for a successful claimant to make a claim, and there are many of these at the moment, what they have to show are three things. Firstly, that they were made a promise that one day the farm would be theirs, or a part of the farm would be theirs. That can be a promise or an assurance or a representation, some sort of positive thing said. Secondly, that they've relied upon that promise. And thirdly, that they've suffered some sort of detriment. Now, that can be financial detriment, such as working for low pay for a number of years. but it can also be just the detriment of staying on the farm for a number of years and not moving off and going off on another career, for example. So if all of those three things can be proved, then the court looks to effectively make good the situation by awarding assets to the farming son or farming daughter, as the case may be. And interestingly, there are two bodies of case law at the moment, and one of those says that what a judge should do if a claimant can successfully demonstrate that they have a claim is make good the promise. So if the promise was one day all of this will be yours, referring to the whole farm, then perhaps the farm in its entirety should be passed to the successful claimant. But the other body of case law is slightly different and says that perhaps the minimum to do justice is what should be awarded. And we're acting on a case in the Supreme Court at the moment with a judgment due out in January or February of this year, which could have the effect of setting a precedent for how those claims are dealt with by judges moving forward. So that's the first area. The second area is partnership agreements. Now, often, unfortunately, many farms out there in partnerships do not have farming partnership agreements. And the danger of that is that where there isn't a partnership agreement, the 1890 Partnership Act, a very historic act, steps in and incorporates terms into the partnership. And these can be terms that you don't want and are completely against what you think the terms of the partnership are. And they can be terms such as profits, who gets what, capital, who owns what, and importantly, things like when a farmer has to retire from the partnership, if a farmer is up to no good, for example, if a partner is up to no good, how can you kick them out of the partnership? There are terms about that incorporated too. One of the worst parts of it is what it says is any farming partner at any stage can simply dissolve the partnership and end it straight away. So if you don't have a partnership agreement, it's certainly sensible to get one. Otherwise, you're caught by all of those 1890 Partnership Act terms, which you may not like. But even if you do have a partnership agreement, often we see that they're quite historic. For example, set up in the 1980s, perhaps, when perhaps mother and father are in the farming partnership, and the two children are brought in, and maybe mother and father have died now, and the two children, maybe a brother and a sister, are effectively in partnership under the same terms. But so much has probably happened since the 1980s. Perhaps farmland's been bought and sold, and lots of issues can come out of this, such as, what are the assets of the partnership? So if one partner decides they want to leave, well, what are the assets of the partnership? What are the value of those assets? And how much should that exiting partner be paid? So even if you do have a partnership agreement, if it's an historic one or if there have been life-changing events, then it needs to be updated. And the final area where we're seeing a lot of claims at the moment are generally on the issue of inheritance and wills. For example, challenges to wills on the grounds that they're not valid. And also where it's alleged that perhaps farmers don't have mental capacity to have made the will at the time of the will. And we're seeing an elderly population growing, and dementia and Alzheimer's are very live issues for a number of families. And so the issue of having that correct legal capacity to make the will is something that's often challenged. So that hopefully gives you a flavour of the types of disputes that we're encountering, specifically within the family farm context. And as I say, it's all over the country, and probably farms quite near you, if not your own farm. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Russell. And we'll go to Ross now. And just to mention that we have got a couple of questions that touch on a couple of the areas that you've mentioned, Russell. So we'll come back to those later. So Ross, if you'd like to talk to us about the areas that you're mainly advising farming families on in this regard.
Yeah, Susie, thank you. Good evening, everybody. Apologies for the technical issues we're facing. Luckily, I've got a face for the radio, so all is not lost. I've been asked to look at common areas on farms and within farming businesses, problems, disputes, decision-making and misunderstandings, which is quite a broad topic. Specifically focusing on matters before the announcement of Brexit and the 2020 Agriculture Act, Elsewhere, there's been plenty said about the future of UK agriculture since that date, BPS reduction in elms, and more particularly since the Oxford Farming Conference earlier this month. But ultimately, these forced changes that we are coming across now have really accelerated problems and issues that we encountered 2 or 3 years ago. And there are a few headlines I want to briefly touch with you all. I'd like to, should be seen in a positive context and for consideration and perhaps as a thought-provoking matter. Some may seem negative, but it shouldn't be seen in that way. Firstly, the first topic is business efficiency and performance. Now, with the removal of BPS and other subsidy, can the farming business stand on its own 2 feet? This has been a question posed and asked for quite a few years, and last year, harvest 2021, rising commodity, reasonable harvest for everybody, arguably the majority of farmers have had quite a good year, irrespective of subsidy. But we trade on a world stage, and if wheat prices fluctuate or lamb prices decrease to the same level as 12 months ago, for example, does the business still make money from commodities? Ultimately, farming businesses are there to make money. They are great fun. It's a lifestyle. It's terribly rewarding. Enormous heritage behind farms and farming businesses. But at the end of the year, if these businesses are losing money, it's quite a slippery slope. Timing of the year where we are now, shooting season is about to finish. Spring cereals won't be drilled for a number of weeks. Lambing scheduled for March and April. Now is the time of year to do a bit of analysis into the farming business and component parts or enterprises to see that every acre is generating return. If losses are identified, then can changes be made or addressed? Can things be done differently? Ultimately, there's no right or wrong answer, but something to be aware of, and if issues can be identified and changed, then so much the better. Secondly, topic of control. And now there's 2 strands to this. Firstly, business control, and secondly, control of costs. If we start on business control, the question, family farm, family dynamics, when's the right time to hand to the next generation? Never an easy discussion, always going to be awkward, and it can be case by case depending on the circumstances. Now, for example, grandfather, 75, 80 years old, and he recently handed control to son, to dad. He's maybe, 50, 55. Son's coming back from university in the next few years, loads of ideas, new perspective, new energy, which may contradict the norm, but the enthusiasm should be harvested. Ultimately, Dad's only been at the helm for 5 years or so and won't really want to hand to the next generation just yet. So it's sort of managing the possible conflict between the generations. Does the younger generation work elsewhere? Do they stay at home? Experience is key. But after some time, it's perhaps looking at other ways of doing things, splitting roles, heading up different enterprises, one doing cereals, the other livestock, one doing beef, one doing sheep, for example, or diversification. Look at other ways of using or utilising buildings or part of farms to generate different income streams. Particularly in this part of the world, tourism, love it or hate it, there are some real success stories out there around camping or glamping. Other areas of friction on the topic of control, we see not contentious, it's difficult to say, but certainly areas of unease. Another family farm scenario, son or daughter lives on the farm, worked on the farm their entire life, ultimately still making the decisions, but only paid quite a low salary for their efforts, and the value they're adding to the business, the performance of the business, is the salary they're getting, a true reflection of that. The second string to the control bow is looking at margins rather than absolute output. Obviously, growth and turnover of the business is key, but it shouldn't be at the detriment of margin or profit. Are there costs that can be reduced or removed altogether? Some costs are unavoidable. Energy, fuel, rent, every 3 years, can be reviewed, obviously, and bank interest charges, for example. Some costs are fluctuating. Fertiliser, this time, incredibly expensive. Will you be putting more nitrogen on your Skyfall wheat to get milling quality, or reduce your fertiliser bill and aim for feed wheat? The output might not be the same, but ultimately the margin may be better. Can some costs be restructured or re-geared? Obviously, if you're on a variable interest rate at the moment, can it be fixed? The likelihood of interest rates rising over the next 3 to 5 years is fairly strong, but we've still got a fairly modest margin compared with other years. Again, HP liabilities, can they be restructured or renegotiated? Or further still, can money be borrowed? Is it time to invest now, do something differently, look at other ways of driving income streams, borrow some money to move away from purely reliance on commodity sales? Or investment in equipment, try and future-proof yourselves and the business to get ahead of any forced change. The third point is planning, and again, 2 strings to this. Firstly, is the business looking ahead? What's the 2-year plan, the 5-year plan, the 10-year plan? Who's in charge? Where's the business going? With change comes opportunity, and with some forethought and planning, yes, there's been negativity around the UK farming in certain spheres, but ultimately there's quite opportunities, and there should be enthusiasm behind that. There will be family motives, historical drivers, because every business should have a goal, whether written or implied, so that everybody with an interest is aware of the direction of travel. And then other planning elements, planning permission. Are there easy wins or hard wins that could be lucrative? With, I suppose, or will planning and therefore development sustain the farming business in a better way through diversification, for example, equine, residential, commercial, tourism, storage, low impact opportunities to diverse income streams away from farming commodities. Every local authority is different, but there are some low-hanging fruit out there in the right locations. And then the final point for me is collaboration and adding value. Adding value, direct sales and local engagement. I think COVID's been incredibly negative for a lot of people, but by virtue of people staying at home, they've really appreciated local produce, utilising local abattoirs to process your livestock, selling in meat boxes, local pubs, local restaurants, charging a premium, and similarly artisan outlets, bakeries, bread makers, brewery, distillery, rapeseed, the open fields of this world and these larger trading entities. There are also smaller, higher value artisan types that are suitable alternative options. I've also got here vending machines. There's a real drive or success stories surrounding those. Yes, they are location specific, but those in the right location have made a real go of selling direct to the consumer, and the story behind it is very well received. Finally, collaboration, combining strengths, combining machinery, or offering or taking contracting services. For example, if you've got a combine, 150,000, 250,000 of cash tied up, and it only really moves for 3 months of the year, could that cash be used elsewhere? Could you and some neighbours collaborate, buy a bigger combine that can do more acreage to service more people? And the same with farming practices, cereal and the livestock sector. Particularly with soil health and organic matter, there's definite collaboration between different farming enterprises for mutual benefit. So a few thoughts there, Susie, and no doubt we'll have a few questions later on.
Yeah, no doubt. Thank you very much, Ross. And we'll hand straight over to Freddie. But just before I do, we've had a question in, just a viewer mentioning that they've only got sound. If they're referring just to Ross's words just now, yes, unfortunately, we've got technical problems getting Ross on camera. So when it's Ross speaking, you've only got sound. You should be able to see everyone else. So do send us a message if you can't. Thank you. So Freddie, to talk about family farm insurance implications. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Susie, for the earlier introduction as well. Yes, my name is Freddie, Braithwaite, Exley. I work as part of the A-Plan Rural team, delivering farm insurance for farms little and large across the country. And between me and the wider team, we cover England, Scotland and Wales. Now, whilst I've been a broker for a good few years now, I actually had a career as a former land agent. So I have been involved in buying insurance as well as selling it. So I've been involved on both sides of the transaction. And what I wanted to do with the few minutes I have now is highlight a couple of areas of insurance that are often a point of discussion on family farms. Now, the first point I want to touch on is why we buy insurance and what it's there for anyway. Well, simply put, insurance is a means of reducing risk or managing risk. When you buy insurance, you transfer the risk to an underwriter who covers the cost of a loss that's insured, ultimately putting you back in a position that you were in before the loss. And the reasons we buy insurance to protect our people, our assets, our income streams from those unforeseen or unforeseeable and unplanned events. And this is particularly important in the context of family farms, is the assets and the income streams that we have and we generate are likely to be something that we pass from generation to generation. Now, for some insurances, there are legal requirements and we can't get away from those, like employer's liability and motor insurances. But there are others that are optional, like your building insurance, your property within those buildings, your losses of revenue. Those are all optional. And whether you choose to take them is entirely up to you. Now, when it comes to how you view these optional insurances, broadly speaking, there are two trains of thought. There are some that like to insure everything, and then quite often those that like to claim for everything as well, every broken tile, every drowned phone, every lost hammer on the farm. But at the other end of the spectrum, you have those that choose to take on a bit more risk themselves and view insurance as disaster recovery only, and claim for only those risks or those losses that really are detrimental to the ongoing of the farm. And there's not necessarily a right or wrong approach to which camp you're in, but how you view your insurances will determine what options you have available to you when it comes to buying them and renewing it. But the last 2 years have seen quite a significant change in insurance rates and the covers that people are offering. And for most family farms, the insurance premium each year is a significant chunk of cash. So many of you will be looking, no doubt, at how you get the most from your insurances and potentially ways of how you can reduce that premium. You may be tempted to claim for some more small stuff that you perhaps wouldn't have done in the past, or you may even look to reduce some of the covers that you have in a bid to save premium. Now, before you do that, I wanted just to flag two traps to avoid for whichever camp you might be in. And the first is the issue with repetitively claiming, particularly for claims of a similar nature. The insurers will start to view these losses as expected rather than fortuitous if you continue to claim for the same thing over and over again. And as a result of that, they're likely to either restrict the cover they can offer or may even reduce it, remove it altogether. And in any instance, they're likely to start increasing premium further. You may also find that actually, if it's a real problem, insurers as a whole will say that they don't want to cover it at all. You might be left in a difficult spot. But to combat this, what you can do and what you should be doing is to show how you're managing the risk and preventing future incidents happening again. And a real common example we see come up is in storm damage claims, of which we've had plenty in the build up to Christmas and the early part of this year already. And easy things to do are to regularly inspect trees next to buildings. Is there a maintenance program in place? Do you wander around and do you have a look at farm buildings and check that they're in good condition, wind and watertight? Do you do simple things like clear gutters or replace cracked tiles? All these things show that you're actively working to work with insurers to mitigate these future losses, and will help you achieve that cover you want and avoid being stung for any premium increases. Now, for those that are in the other camp and looking to reduce their, or rather take on more risk and reduce their premium, you have to be really careful in doing this. And a broker is a key part in making sure you get this right and not expose yourself too much. What you want to consider is where your largest exposures are, and then perhaps work back from that. Now, in my opinion, liability claims is a huge area, and the claims in such instances can run into the many millions of pounds. And it's of paramount importance to make sure you've got the right limit of indemnity. Now, how you choose that limit is considering what a worst case scenario would be. And whilst it might be a slightly dark way of looking at things, but you have to look at who's coming onto the farm and in what context. Have you got lots of young people on the farm? Have you got, are they groups of people or individuals? And what are they exposed to? How likely they are to suffer a loss or injury? And that will help you give a gauge whether you take out £10 million of public liability insurance or 15 or 20. Similarly, your losses of revenue, people can save money by reducing the cover there, but Your revenue is the lifeblood of the farm, and actually that can be an incredibly important insurance over and above potentially your building insurance, because without that revenue, you can't continue to run. So the more sensible options for saving money in that sort of area might be looking at things like taking a higher excess or specifying perils pertinent to the properties that you have. We see lots of farms where the same perils are insured on all buildings, regardless of whether they're on top of a hill or at the bottom of the hill. There's no point buying flood insurance if it's right on top of a hill and never going to flood. Similarly, why include accidental damage cover on a property when you've got the tenancy agreement, which makes the tenant responsible for accidental damage cover? Now, I mentioned these bits and pieces, but in relation to insurance, but it's worth remembering that insurance is only part of this, or part of the solution to securing the future of your farm. It goes hand in hand with good risk management, clear communication, and a well thought out approach. Prevention is always going to be the best way or best form of defense. However, having the right cover should give you some peace of mind should the worst happen. Now, in all of what I've just said, please don't think you're alone in considering how you go about buying insurance. Your insurance broker very much works for you. I think that's sometimes forgotten, that we're not just there to sell something to you, but we're also there to give you advice, find the right cover, and advise you on what risks and exposures there might be. And I think this is often what differentiates a good broker from a great broker. However, in order for us to do this, one of the key things is that you must be open and transparent with us about what's going on the farm. Tell us everything, and we can then go and negotiate on your behalf with all the information. So when you're considering diversification, like Ross mentioned, or creating new entities for tax purposes or whatever it might be, selling or buying, give us a call, email us, or engage with us on a Zoom call or a face-to-face meeting, no matter how small, weird, or wacky the query is, and we can help in guiding you through that process. And we can explore options for what cover there might be available, or even for what cover there might not be available. And in doing so, we might just be able to help with the decision-making process and give you a bit of peace of mind that your family farm is protected.
That's great. Thank you very much, Freddie. So that wraps up our presentations, and thanks to everyone for their advice and expertise. We will go straight to questions, and don't forget, please, for those watching, that you can type in a question into the box at the foot of your screen, and it'll get added to the list, and hopefully we can get through them all in the next 45 minutes. So first of all, this is one for Russell. First of all, a legal one. We've been advised to put our property into a trust for our daughter to help protect her interests from any ill intentions with regard to a life partner, or from huge tax bills that she can't afford to pay when we pass on. Do you have any advice with regard to such trusts? So I think certainly Russell first, and then Freddie might have something to say on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. The issue of trusts, it's an important tool in succession planning. Briefly, what a trust is effectively where you set up a trust and you perhaps place assets within a trust. And there are trustees that you appoint, people that you trust, and they have control of the trust, and they can choose what to do with the assets within the trust, and perhaps with the income generated by those trust assets. So one thing that's I'm not sure is clear from the question is whether it's suggested that this person should pass assets into the trust within the family home into the trust during their life or not. We normally advise against that because if farming mother and father, for example, do that, they lose control of the family farming, of the farmhouse, for example, if they were to place it into trust. So typically not advisable during one's lifetime because you lose control. However, upon death, it's different, and it may be upon the first death or it may be upon the second death. But by placing an asset into trust, it's often a very good way to mitigate capital gains tax. So that's a big advantage of the trust. Another advantage of trusts is that they can be more flexible. So let's say we have a situation where there are, let's say, several siblings who are all listed as the beneficiaries within the trust. If you were to pass the farm to the three siblings without a trust, so they were just to get it ordinarily, then they'd perhaps have a third each, or if there was a dispute, they might agree to own a third each. Whereas if it goes into a trust, what if, for example, one of the siblings became disabled, for example, and suddenly couldn't work anymore and suddenly needed a lot of care? Now, if you were alive, you might think, well, I'd rather give a bit more of the assets or generate an income or pay some more of the income to that disabled child because they can't earn. But if you'd passed the farm to all three siblings, then they would all own the farm, a third, and a third. And you wouldn't have that flexibility. You'd be dead. Whereas if you place it into a trust, you could ask the trustees to consider such matters, for example, and they might award more of the trust assets to the disabled child. So it can be a bit more flexible. Now, once your assets are placed into that trust, they're controlled by the trustees. So you've really got to trust those trustees. And what you can also do when setting up the trust is to write what's known as a letter of wishes, which isn't binding, but it does provide guidance to the trustees as to the sorts of things you would like them to do when managing the trusts, for example. So who to give priority to or in what circumstances. So they're more flexible, and also it can be a wide class of beneficiaries. So it might be your children that are the beneficiaries of the trust, but it could be their children. It could be unborn children as well. So you're really looking after your farm for future generations. So those are some of the issues that you have to consider when deciding whether a trust is right for you.
Thank you very much, Russell. Freddie, did you have? I think you might have something to say on trusts as well. Is that right?
Yeah, it was only a comment to add further to what Russell said, and he's absolutely right when he says you need to have trust in your trustees, because ultimately they have they're running the farm for you But is the point on trustees' indemnity insurance? With that trust comes a lot of responsibility, and trustees' indemnity insurance is a way of protecting their personal interests as managers of the trust, essentially. And it's just an insurance worth exploring if you are setting up trusts to protect your trustees.
Okay.
Sorry to interject, Susie, but I saw another part of the question actually is about sort of keeping it out of the clutches potentially of a life partner who perhaps the parents don't like, and this is an issue which a lot of farming families have to grapple with, how to try and keep the assets of the farm within the sort of bloodline of the family, I suppose. And setting up a trust is perhaps a way to do that, because if, for example, upon the divorce of the farming daughter from her fella who perhaps the family don't get on with, for example, if the assets are not belonging to the farming daughter, then upon that divorce, they may not form part of what we call the matrimonial pot. And therefore the fella can't get his mitts on the sort of family silver, so to speak. It's not quite as black and white as that, and the courts have quite large discretion as to what they can take into account and what they consider to be part of the matrimonial pot. But it's certainly a way of trying to protect the family farm and the family silver.
Okay, thank you both very much. So we'll move straight on to our next question, which is one for, I think, for Ross. Yeah, it's an interesting one, this, because we've got this issue has arisen with a feature that's going in Farmers Weekly next week. Will anyone using land for non-agricultural production, i.e. birdseed mixes and so on, be considered to be a non-agricultural enterprise and therefore potentially forfeit their agricultural property relief from inheritance tax? Or could it then come under business property relief, or will all relief be lost? Ross, are you there to answer that one?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, thank you, Susie. Good question. And I'm not a tax expert, but the definition of agriculture, if we're looking at agricultural property relief, is the science or practice of farming, including cultivation of the soil for the growing of crops, and that's quite an important part, and the rearing of animals to provide food, wool, and other products. Yeah. I mean, it hasn't been tested, and it's difficult to say, but you'd like to think, or you'd certainly like to consider that if you're growing bird seed, it's a form of food for consumption, much as you grow barley for feed for livestock. Bird seed mixes, it's to feed the birds. You'd certainly like to think that if it isn't agricultural, then yes, it's part of the farming business, so it's potentially a business property relief. But I think there must have been a lot of forethought, you would like to think, in Westminster about this and about how the tax implications. And whilst I wouldn't hang my hat on it, I think you would like to think you were safe.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know, Russell, whether you've got any conflicting views.
No, I don't. No, well put.
Yeah, and I guess that, I mean, in this case, bird seed mixes could be bird seed mixes in order to produce seed as a product to feed to birds, or it could be in an environmental scheme with bird seed mixes being sown simply for birds to feed on, through the season. So there are two angles there. I'm not sure.
And whilst HLS is an agri-environment scheme, the new ELMS is environment land management.
Yes.
So there's quite a different nuance to it, but I think the same sentiment is there.
And of course, we're still waiting to hear what sort of tax treatment some of the schemes are going to get, including the lump sum exit scheme and ELM in general. So still to hear on that. Okay, thank you, Ross. And another one for Russell here. Yeah, it goes very much to what you were talking about before, Russell, about getting things in writing, not partnership agreements in this case, but the question is, how can a tenancy agreement exist with no signing of any legal or non-legal tenancy, with brothers paying a nominal payment, which the accountants classify as rent? The nominal payment was £30 per year and has been for the last 30 years without review. It's been paid by the questioner, the farm business, paid by the questioner to himself and his brother, who co-own the farm itself. It's causing an issue with gaining full agricultural relief following the death of the questioner's brother, who he farmed with. So sort of slightly around the houses there, but that's the detail of the question. Russell.
Yes, I think the first thing to say, and it's perhaps quite surprising, but a tenancy does not need to be in writing. A tenancy is a contract, and there are plenty of contracts which you and I will enter into every day. We walk into a shop or a market stall, we buy a pasty, we hand over our money, we get the pasty. That's a contract, and it doesn't have to be in writing. And the same is true of tenancy agreements. Also of significance, the fact that it's a minimal rent being paid is irrelevant. Whether it's a massive rent or a minimal rent, or in fact no rent at all. It's not a prerequisite of a tenancy to have money changing hands. So again, that's not relevant either. I suppose thirdly, it potentially it's an Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy, which could be very valuable. I recently dealt with a case where an Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy was valued at about £1 million, for example. And then, as I'm sure a lot of the viewers know, there can be successions with Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies, which can stay in the family for generations and many years. So hence the value.
Okay, thank you. So essentially, it is a tenancy, whether a rent has passed or not, and
it could be.
Yeah, and that, if it is, that could affect significantly the claim for relief from inheritance tax.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So to our next question, this is going to be for Ross initially. Some ideas about how to cope with high input costs, particularly fertiliser, depending on what you're using, nitrogen-wise, anything up to 750 a tonne and a bit more, I think, if you're using urea this week, with no guaranteed price for the cereal that results, and they're going to make a loss this year. What financial help is available for grants, innovation, nitrogen replacement ideas? So quite a broad range of ideas there. Ross, can you give any advice on that one, please?
Yeah, how to avoid the £750 a tonne for fertiliser, I think, is the $1 million question. Very difficult. It is. You know, if you've got a local chicken farm you can collaborate with, you know, it doesn't deliver the same in terms of its nitrogen level, but it's a step in the right direction. I think a lot of people will be thinking twice this year whether, you know, as I said in my brief presentation, whether to stomach that or sort of aim a bit lower. But in terms of financial help for grants innovation, I mean, and the DEFRA website's pretty good at showing the grant schemes that are available. There's what seems to be quite a short window for a lot of them. And recently, the Farming Equipment and Technology Fund, which provided a set list of grants between 2,000 and 25,000, and you know, a set suite of items you could apply for. Unfortunately, the deadline shut for that on the 7th of January, and similarly, on the 12th of January, the Farming Transformation Fund closed, which is for much larger sort of technical or substantial technology and other sort of business performance ideas. So they were two that have come and gone. In terms of other sort of grants that are available, and the Countryside Stewardship is very good for this. The capital grant window is open for water and air quality and for boundary trees and orchards. Again, the window will close later in the sort of early spring in terms of the window for applying. But there is money out there, albeit it covers costs rather than labour as well. But there is a pot to pull upon to help do things on farm. At a more local level, water catchment grants. There was a farming innovation program that closed in November, but we've all heard there will be more and more coming down the track, and it's just a question of keeping your eyes peeled, I think.
Yeah, thanks. I think that, yes, as you said, there'll be more rounds, but it's just because the deadlines are fairly tight. It's a question of anticipating what you want and getting things a bit lined up in anticipation of the next round.
And also the supply chain. If a supplier suddenly gets 20 orders when he only normally sells 5 per year, but you have to claim your money by a certain time later in this year. I think it's September time. It's just making sure the supply chain, your suppliers, can get the equipment in before you place your order. I mean, these grant schemes are competitive, which means you need to be given the green light before you place your order, obviously. But a bit of forethought and planning.
And I mean, that just raises an issue that's been in the news lately in terms of the lead time on some of the kit that you might want to buy because of the supply issues we're having and delays in delivery. It gets more tricky to take advantage of the schemes because it's very unpredictable as to when things will actually arrive, and they've had to, I think, extend some of the claim deadlines several times on different schemes because of that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Freddie, did you want to come in on that one?
Yes, please. Yeah, I mean, we've raised lots of points in there, actually, in particular on the supply chain side of things. But actually, to cover off the fertilizer costs and where they've gone in the last few months, it's worth pointing out that actually lots of farms do insure their fertilizer and sprays. Some choose not to. But given that the values have gone up so much, it's worth reviewing whether you do have cover for dead stock. Do you insure your sprays, your fuel, your diesel, your fertilizer? Is it all kept in one site? With the increase in value, it's unsurprising that we might expect to see potential thefts of these things increase on farm as well. And the point of supply chains is actually pertinent to building sums insured and sums insured across the board. You'll have seen, or you may have seen in the reviews of insurances this year, that the index linking rates have been substantially higher than years gone by, and that is because of disrupted supply chains and the increased cost of building materials. So it's worth considering if your sums insured are still accurate, and there's multiple ways about going to do that, either by following the index linking recommendations or by getting a valuation done, which will get it down absolutely on the nod as to what it would cost you to rebuild properties or replace kit. Yeah,
so I mean, people would tend to review their insurance as the year end's coming up, their policy year end. Would you say then, with some of the increases that we've seen recently, that it would be worth reviewing within the year and not waiting for the year end?
Certainly with things like stock where you're buying stuff in, yeah, I keep a finger on it. You can always make changes to your policy throughout the term. With building sums insured, quite often you will have bought something called day one uplift, and where you will see that on your policy is where you'll have a declared value, and then you might have something that says 15% day one uplift or even more, and that's the sum insured. And what that 15% or what that day one uplift is an allowance for movements in rebuild costs throughout the term. It's a really useful cover to have in place, as I say, particularly or in times as we've had in the last 2 years where supply chains have been so affected.
Okay, thank you. And is that something that's standard on most policies, the day one uplift thing, or is it something you'd have to ask for?
No, it's not standard to be included, but it's something you can ask for, and it's something that's I think pretty widely offered by a lot of insurers.
Okay, thank you. And we'll go straight to you on the next one as well, which is about VAT, building insurance and averaging. Farm business might be able to reclaim VAT on rebuild costs for farm buildings, but on cottages things are less clear. A rent, even a token amount paid by the occupier, makes the cottage an exempt supply, so VAT's not recoverable except in the case of a total loss when costs are zero rated. That's all background. The actual query is whether they should add 20% VAT to the farm cottage insurance values. I presume that's on the insuring the income, and risk being overinsured and averaging being applied rather than save a little on premiums, but risk being 20% underinsured.
Yeah, I've got the gist of the question. It's a really good question. VAT and insurance and sums insured is a topic in itself, and unfortunately, it's not a question that either has a yes you should or no you shouldn't simple answer. Belt and braces include 20% on your building sums insured. The reality is the nuances of the VAT applications is that some properties will be exempt from VAT, some will be recoverable, and some won't be. But if you want to be absolutely sure that you're covered, include 20% on both your residential and your farm buildings. And in terms of the averaging element of it, we just touched on it in supply chains and how you be accurate, but having a valuation done is the belt and braces way to do that. And you can either have a whole farm valuation done, which gets you values for every single property you have, or you might do a sample valuation where you pick out some buildings and compare that to the sums insured you've got elsewhere on the farm. And that way you get a gauge of whether the rest of the farm sums insured are accurate or they've come somewhere adrift. And there are further benefits other than just being accurate with your sums insured. Some insurers will guarantee a valuation to say that if you've insured the farmhouse for 250,000 and you have a total loss and it costs you slightly more, they will cover you for the full amount because you've done everything within your reasonable powers to ensure that you've got it comprehensively insured.
Okay, great, thank you. Right, we have got one now, which another insurance question for it says for Russell, but I think it might be Ross. When renting out farm buildings to third parties, who pays for the insurance cover and the VAT question again, which we've already covered really. So Ross, when you're renting out farm buildings to third parties, who should be covering the insurance?
Usually, a landlord would certainly value the structure of the building.
Yeah.
Contents would be the tenant's responsibility. Sometimes the landlord can charge an insurance rent, which is a bit of a top up to cover any additional liabilities. But structure is normally landlords. Some landlords don't at all. Some do. Content, everything inside, tenants.
Yeah. Okay. And sorry, Russell, did you want to come in on that one as well before I go to Freddie?
Well, not particularly, other than to say, I suppose it depends on the circumstances. It's not black or white. It depends, and as Ross said, I think if I were the landlord, I would want to be insuring my building, because if you pass on that responsibility to the tenant and they don't do it, and you try to sue them when it goes up in flames, then they might not have any money. So I would want to insure it as a landlord.
Thank you. And so finally to Freddie on that one as well, just briefly.
Exactly as Russell and Ross have just said. Essentially, you just have to think about who has the asset to lose. ultimately it's the landlord that owns the building, and therefore they should insure it. Whether they choose to recharge that premium to the tenant is their own prerogative. But
Yeah.
certainly, as it's your asset to lose, I would be wanting to arrange my own insurances and see that it's correct.
Okay, good. Thank you. Next question is, very general one, and probably one that most of the audience are interested in. To Ross, do you have any tips for avoiding too much inheritance tax? Well, it depends what the definition of what too much is, but, but avoiding it generally, yeah.
Yeah, the difference between avoiding and evading, isn't there? I'm no tax expert, so yes, there are tips, there are reliefs, agricultural property relief, business property relief, plenty of case law, a suite of case law that applies to properties. It is a case-by-case basis. Andrew Burst, McKenna, Balfour, all of these are relating to inheritance tax claims and where agricultural property relief or business property relief is applied. Planning, look at the circumstances, plan, look ahead, ownership of property, occupation of property, use of property. It's one of those that there's no right and wrong answer here and now, but it is all case specific, and certainly professional advice should be sought.
Yeah, and in terms, as you mentioned, planning, I think, just tracking down documents, whether it's deeds or other, agreements of any type, can take quite a long time sometimes. And so I think, even if it's a couple of years in advance of moving assets around, I think advisors would generally say you just can't start too early on that.
You're absolutely right. You can't start too early. And the day you think, oh, crikey, we need to start, is often the day it's too late. So, do it while you're thinking about it, waiting.
Okay, thank you. And then got another one for Ross. Again, you said you're not a tax expert, but we have a question asking, does Woodland qualify for inheritance tax relief?
If it's been managed for business purposes, it'll qualify for business property relief.
Yeah.
And it needs to have shown that it's been commercially managed, point number one. And point number two, needs to be owned for a minimum of 2 years. The management should be with a view to generating timber income or capital gain from the increase in the value of the timber. And that should be sort of substantiated or evidenced by a management plan, ideally that's signed off by the Forestry Commission or similarly governing body that can rubber stamp it, where the objective is for timber production, and that is evidence that the plan has been actioned and updated with, proof of budget, income, expenditure, etc. APR is possible. Also, there's something called woodland relief, but it's the two of those are pretty spurious or difficult to prove. And I think, the BPR, business property relief aspect, is easier as long as it is proved and legitimate.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Ross, can I ask as well? Is natural capital likely to feature in that business property relief going forward as well as a business element, or is that a whole other can of worms we're going to open?
That's a can of worms that I'm sort of slightly fidgeting in my chair to answer here now.
Okay, we'll save it for another day.
Again, thank you both. Back to planning on that, because if you've got woodland that isn't currently managed in a way that it might qualify, then if you're thinking about it early enough and you have time, presumably that management could be put in to put you in a better position to benefit from the reliefs. Okay, so we have lots of questions. Right. This is on an Agricultural Holdings Act or a traditional tenancy, and question for Ross, although I don't know whether Russell might want to come in on it as well. What advice would the panel give to a 70-year-old who'd like to hand in his retirement notice?
Shall I go first?
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
My recommendations would be to consider all of your options carefully and then make a plan. Succession is, prior to the 12th of July 1984, an AHA, Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy, has 2 successions possible. Succession can take place either on death of the tenant or on retirement, assuming they are over the age of 65, although that's changed recently. it's important for if you're going for a retirement succession application and you're unsuccessful, the applicant cannot reapply for succession upon death of the current tenant. So there's quite a lot of ducks to get in line before you go for it. There's also sort of process to follow in respect of notices, but the main considerations: is there a successor? Are they suitable? Are they eligible? The Agriculture Act was passed in November 2020. There a few changes have come about the eligibility and suitability criteria, and principally, in terms of the suitability test, there's been quite a number of tests around health, training, experience, and finance. But the new test is: does the applicant have the ability to farm commercially to high standards of efficient production and care for the environment? So, quite a lot of things to look at to make sure that if you're or handing in a retirement notice for a succession application, that the next generation have got everything they need. So the answer is yes. There's also more changes that are due to come into effect from September 24. But in short, look at your options and plan before doing anything.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you. We've got lots of questions coming in from the panel. I'm just going to take a moment to have a quick look. One for Freddie. There are various family members living and working on the farm. Some have their own insurance and some are insured as part of the farm policy. Freddie, because we've got so many questions, would you be able to cover the question very quickly, which is, should everyone have their own insurances, or is it okay to just sort of have it slightly ad hoc, as this seems to be?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer to the game, but ultimately you can have everybody insured on one policy, and in doing so, you benefit from economies of scale, and you may also find that you're reducing the likelihood of gaps in cover arising. On the flip side, if you have individual policies for each individual, then their claims records don't affect each other at all. But preferably, I like to see them all together, because then, as I say, you end up benefiting economies of scale, and there's nothing that can slip between the gaps. Or slip between the properties.
Thank you. And one for Russell now, I think, although it could apply to all professional advice, really. At the Farming Community Network, they often receive calls relating to some of the issues that you referred to, Russell. So I guess proprietary, estoppel, partnership issues, wills, inheritance. But the person calling might not be in a financial position to be able to secure legal advice. Do you have any suggestions for how that person might be able to access professional help?
Yes, there are various different ways that one can fund litigation as a client. Typically, it's paying for it on a monthly basis, say. But if you haven't got the funds, then insurance is a possible option. I mean, many household insurance policies provide what we call legal expenses insurance, which can perhaps pay for the legal fees of a solicitor. So that's one thing to bear in mind. Secondly, another point is something called Conditional Fee Agreements, which are known as no-win, no-fee agreements, where in short someone doesn't need to pay for the legal fees as the case progresses, and only pays for it in the event that they win. So that's another option. So there are different ways to fund it if you haven't got money, potentially.
Okay, thank you. And this is another one definitely for you, Russell. If an Agricultural Holdings Act tenant stopped farming his rented land approximately 20 years ago, gets local farmers to manage it, buy all the seeds and fertilizers and so on, does no work on the land, the tenant does no work on the land themselves, is his tenancy secure, especially as he has another non-agricultural business? In Scotland, it would not be. So we're talking English law here. So Russell.
Well, I'm very lucky because in our team we have one of the leading experts in Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy cases. So his name's Duncan Sigourney, and maybe if I can ask Duncan to give him a call, because it's an area that I passed completely to my colleague Duncan.
Okay,
but
right.
he
Well,
would
we're trying to make sure that we get that
we will do that.
question answered separately. Thank you. And another one for Russell, short and to the point. How do you stop rogue partners running off with farm earnings?
Well, hopefully there's a partnership agreement, and hopefully that will set out the terms of the partnership, including what happens if partners are up to no good and are. Each partner typically has what we call a fiduciary duty to one another, so they've got to act with the utmost good faith to one another, and if they don't, it's typically a breach of the partnership agreement. So the partnership could sue that partner for a breach of the partnership agreement, whether the terms set out in the partnership agreement itself, a written partnership agreement, or whether it's brought in by way of that 1890 Partnership Act I mentioned at the beginning. But there's certainly a remedy to rectify it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Right. Just go to another question. I'm just going to check the ones that have come in most recently. Yes, this is an interesting insurance one. About property owners' liability. We're tenant farmers. Our landlord insures the buildings for normal perils. Our insurers have recently asked us to ask the landlord whether they have property owners' liability, which they don't. Maintenance of the buildings is partially the landlord, for example, roofs, and partially shared 50-50. So if a roof sheet blew off and damaged someone's parked vehicle, who should pay the premium for the liability cover? I think the question is who should have paid the premium for that liability cover. It's a bit of a complicated situation by the sound of it in terms of this shared.
Sorry, yeah, I'm not sure I followed the question entirely. It sounded like the landlord hadn't bought their own insurance and the tenant had bought insurance.
Well, it seems that the landlord doesn't have what they're calling property owners liability cover, which I presume would be.
So your property owner liability cover would extend to cover damage to third-party property.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's what would have responded in that instance.
Yeah.
Most landlords should have that cover if they're insuring the buildings.
Yeah. Well, apparently this one doesn't.
If they don't, it may well be that the liability then falls upon the tenant. And their insurance policy will, if they have it, should also have public liability insurance. But without looking at the policy wordings,
yeah, it's quite a
difficult
one to answer because the maintenance of the buildings is partially down to the landlord, the roof. And if a roof sheet blew off and damaged a parked vehicle, and there wasn't cover on that, then would you sue the landlord? I don't know. The property owner.
It's subject to what's the terms of the lease in terms of the policy agreement or policy.
Yeah.
If it's partially responsible rather than totally responsible, there's clearly a grey area.
Yeah. Okay. And this one's probably, this has just come in, is probably for Ross. What's your view on farms deploying renewable energy infrastructure that makes use of farm waste as an approach to diversifying revenue? So either selling electricity and or biomethane and its byproducts to reduce fertilizer costs as well. To what extent are farms open to working with renewable energy companies to jointly fund and own such infrastructure? Ross, do you get involved in advising on renewable energy?
Yeah, we do. I mean, in this part of the world, well, in sort of the more dairy-centric parts of the world, AD plants have been quite a success and quite popular. Depending on the feed-in tariff and the rates that have been secured would depend on the success of those, and certainly the appetite for them has dropped off. Now it all depends on grid capacity, grid connection, and sourcing the supply. There's a lot of conversation a few years ago about AD plants renting land at a considerably stronger level than conventional farmers were to secure maize to go into to create silage as the feedstuff for AD plants. Collaboration is there. There's enthusiasm for it. I think as long as both parties can benefit for it, or from it, then it's a good thing. There's quite a lot of appetite in this part of the world at the moment for solar because there's grid connection or there's capacity in the grid. But from the sort of feed stuff, the manure side of things, it depends on who and where, I suppose, and what each party can offer the other for mutual benefit.
Okay.
Susie, just to add to that also, in that world of renewables, the sort of general whole farm insurers are particularly mindful or conscious of renewable energies at the moment. And actually, if you're doing large scale projects like that, it's likely to be something that falls outside their appetite. So you'll require specialist insurance.
Specialists. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's good point. Right. We have another one. Russell. This one's probably one for you. The farm's owned by 4 people, all aged over 70, and it is to go on their death to the next generation. How do we cope when there could be more than 10 or 20 years between each death?
I think the devil's going to be in the detail there because it really depends on what basis they own it. For example, do they own it under the terms of a partnership agreement, in which case the partnership agreement will set out what happens in the event of a partner's death.
Right.
Or do they simply own it? They could own it. It could be a company and they could be shareholders. Or do they simply own it not in a partnership but in their personal capacities? And in which case, what would happen in the event of one of their deaths? Query if it would be a claim under what's known as the Trusts of Land and Appointment of Trustees Act. Without knowing the basis upon which they own it, it's really impossible to say.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, flipping around a bit, but we've got another one come in during the session, which is simply says problem with soil tipped without an agreement. So I guess that's basically fly tipping. Freddie, do you want to have a quick word on that? And then I don't know, Russell, whether that comes within, probably not within your specialism, but you might want to have a word on it. Freddie, we'll go to you first in terms of whether that might be covered by insurance.
It's worth having a look. Quite a lot of farm policies extend some sort of fly tipping cover, both for the material waste clearage, but also for any environmental liability that might come out of it, pollution and contaminants. It's certainly been a problem in the last 18 months. When we closed a lot of the refuse sites, actually, we saw an increase across quite a lot of places in the countryside. But yeah, I'd have a look at your policy wording. There's quite often some cover that you don't necessarily have opted in for, but it's quite often in there.
Right. So you're saying it's not, you would have to opt in generally?
No, it's quite often included as standard.
Yeah.
So you might not have seen it before, but it might well be written in there.
Yeah.
Even if you didn't think you had it.
Yeah. Russell, any thoughts on that one?
Did it say what was dumped in particular in the question?
Soil. It's just said soil, but I mean that could cover a lot of.
Yeah. Well, if we knew who did it, potentially dumping soil on someone else's land is a nuisance, and you could sue for damages for the clear-up costs, essentially. Yeah. If you don't know who's done it, then obviously it's more of a problem. But depending on what has been dumped, there could also be environmental issues which you as a landowner are responsible for. So it perhaps depends on what, as I say, what's dumped and by whom.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And one for Ross, I think, who keeps saying he's not a tax expert, and I know Ross, but just you might have an opinion on this, and I think the answer might be we don't know because it hasn't really been tested yet. Do you lose agricultural property relief on arable land which is now occupied by a solar farm?
Oh, yeah, hasn't been tested. It's going to be my answer.
Yeah.
So the tax expert would certainly need to get their teeth into that, I think. Because, there could be, I'll keep quiet, I think, sorry.
All right, no, not to worry, thank you. Right, and perhaps another very quick one. Any idea, Ross, on whether there are grants for dry stone walling?
We get asked that a fair bit in sort of the area of the Cotswolds that we cover. At the moment, No, I mean there are boundary through countryside stewardship and the capital grants. There are boundary grants available, capital grants available. For wall. It's so expensive, and if there are grants, it doesn't really cover the cost of labour or materials. So, unfortunately, no, not in a big way. The local enterprise partnerships, sort of local funding levels, sometimes would have funding available, but at the moment, no, I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, just very quickly, I'm going to ask our back office to put a poll on the screen now. If you have time to just click an answer to it. It's about succession and whether people have made succession plans or not. And while that's going on, I just mentioned that we have had a couple of very complex questions in with some sort of family personal detail, which we will try and get answered separately. We've got your email addresses, so we'll be able to hopefully get somebody to do that for you after the session, but they're just a bit complicated. Apologies for my house phone ringing then, it's gone now. So if the poll is there, please do answer it, and then we will wrap up very shortly.
Susie, on that, there's been lots of detailed questions this evening, actually. I'm very happy if people want to reach out and ask their questions that have perhaps gone round. Please feel free to do so. I'm very happy to come back to them personally on those points. That's
great. Thank you. Right, so I'll just review quickly in case we've got any that come in that we haven't covered. Yeah, there's one here. If a farm's land has been placed in a trust, but the buildings belong to the partnership, who actually owns the buildings? Russell.
Would you repeat that? Sorry, so would you mind repeating that?
If a farm's land has been placed in a trust, but the buildings belong to the partnership, who does own the buildings?
Yeah, I don't know without looking into it, quite frankly. That seems a bit of a cop-out answer, but it depends on a number of factors, I think.
Yeah, I mean, if the land was specifically, if the buildings were specifically excluded from the trust, that would be one thing. But yeah, as you say,
it might depend upon what is the basis for the buildings being in situ. What is the legal basis for them being in situ? Is it under the terms of a license or a lease of some sort? And does that specify?
Yeah. Okay. Again, down to the detail and the document, finding those documents and having a good look. Yeah. Okay. Well, it just remains for me to thank the panel then for we've had questions. It's been a great sort of range of questions that we've had, and we've had a lot of advice back from the panel. So thank you all very much. Thanks to everybody for registering and attending, and for putting in your questions. As I say, we will try and answer some of those more complex ones directly and get the experts to come back to you. So thanks very much, everyone, and I hope it's been a good evening for the audience. I'm sure there's been a lot of advice and plenty to think about and take away. Thank you.
Thank you.